Hey everybody, and welcome to my third of 4 videos about the Pentax K-S1. This video is going to focus on the menu system and contents, that is, everything that is accessible when you push the menu button. So there's an index in the description that you can use to jump to a specific menu item. So the way that the menus are organized in the K-S1 and the organization of this video will follow is first we have the record menu symbolized by that camera in the top left corner of the screen, and there are 4 menus for that. Next we have the video menu, which there is 1 menu for. Next we have the playback menu, which only has 1 menu. And the wrench symbolizes the setup menu, which has 4 menus. The last one is the customs setting menu, which has 4 menus. And then we go back to the first. So if you would like to go to a specific menu screen, look in the index for the type of menu and the number of the screen, and the index, by clicking on the number, will take you to the part of the video that discusses that menu screen. Otherwise, we're just going to go through left to right. The first is the record menu, screen 1. Here we have custom image, and custom image allows you to alter the way that the camera records color in JPEG files. Your options are bright. This is ideally suited for bright light. Natural, which gives you the most natural setting, and as you can see here, this represents the color space. The outside of the hexagon, represents each of the 6 color channels: green, cyan, blue, magenta, red, and yellow. The inside, that smaller green hexagon, represents where each of the points are. Are they evenly balanced, as they are for all 6 in this one? Or in the first, is there slightly more red and blue and cyan? The third is portrait mode, and portrait mode is good for portraits, and it adds a little bit of green and magenta to the coloration to make people's skin tones pop a bit. The next is landscape. Landscape is good for landscapes and adds a little bit of red, yellow, green, cyan, and blue, and keeps the same amount of magenta so that the natural colors that are most prevalent in landscapes pop a little bit more. And what I mean by pop is that as the dots in the inner hexagon move outward, that increases the amount of saturation for each of those colors. So where red is right now, that is more saturated on the red channel than portrait mode. The next is vibrant. Vibrant adds a bunch of magenta, cyan, and green with a little bit of red, just to make some of those colors more, well, vibrant. After vibrant is radiant. Radiant meaning like a radiant, healthy glow, which adds a lot of yellow and blue and a good amount of red and cyan. Here we have muted, and muted simply reduces evenly all of the colors compared to natural lighting. Bleach bypass does some very strange things with the coloration. Reversal film is my personal favorite setting, and when I shoot JPEGs, I almost always have it in reversal film. In addition to altering the color very slightly to add a little bit of magenta and green, it also increases contrast a little bit, and the result is that it really makes colors vibrant and causes image to just look very nice. If you're interested in trying any of these, this is a good one to start with, as the results are typically very good. Black and white has no color data. It converts everything to grayscale. And cross-processing does strange things with the coloration, and you can see it has also taken out the color scale there. It's experimental. Yeah, you can do some experimental stuff with this. So I'm going to leave it at reversal film and hit OK, and now I am set to reversal film. and the little icon there tells me what I'm set to. So if you have all of those memorized, you'll know what you're set to. Here we have the image capture settings. This allows me to choose what file format. The three options are JPEG. The camera will only save JPEGs, and as you can see, that has a lot of storage space on this 32 gigabyte memory card. It can actually take 1770 files, but there's already some space used. RAW saves only RAW, and I believe it can actually take closer to 900 RAW images, but again, there's some space used on this memory card. And RAW plus JPEG can take 532, give or take, RAW plus JPEG files, and that means when you take the photo, it saves the camera raw data as well as a JPEG of the same image. This is really good if you have a computer that doesn't show you a preview of your RAW files. The first time I shot RAW, I only shot RAW. I had no JPEGs, and I came back with 738 RAW files and had no idea what any of them were. So after that, I started shooting RAW and JPEG so that when I open them up on my computer, I can see a preview in Explorer of what the image is that the raw data will display. It makes file processing a whole lot easier to shoot RAW plus JPEG. Plus that way, if you don't want to process every file as RAW, you still have the JPEGs and you can send those out quickly or just post them online. JPEG record pixels applies only to JPEGs and indicates the size of the JPEG. Large is 5,472 pixels by 3,648. Medium is slightly smaller. Small is slightly smaller, and extra small is very small. This is the size of a computer monitor, 2 megapixels, 1920 by 1280. JPEG quality is how high quality the JPEGs are. 3 stars being the best, 1 star being the worst. And RAW file format is whether it's DNG or PEF. PEF is the Pentax specific RAW file format, and not every software recognizes it. DNG is a universal file format, and unless you are using Pentax specific software all the time and exclusively, DNG is the better option for shooting raw data. To get out of this menu, we will hit Menu, and now we're back at the first screen, where we can select autofocus settings. Autofocus mode has 3 to choose from: AFA, AFS, and AFC. AFA means autofocus automatic. AFS means autofocus servo or single. And AFC means autofocus continuous. So autofocus automatic will choose the best autofocus mode between single and continuous. Autofocus single will focus on an object. Here we go. We are focusing on my hand with autofocus. Now, if my hand moves, it doesn't matter. The focus is locked. It's not going to follow my hand. However, let's say we're in autofocus continuous. There we go. My autofocus is focused on my hand. Hand is gone. It is going to refocus on the camera. My hand is back. Autofocus focuses on that. As my hand moves, autofocus follows it. The disadvantage to autofocus continuous is that it takes fewer pictures in burst mode because the autofocus struggles to find what's in focus between each shot. Autofocus single has a disadvantage in that if you're trying to do sports photography and the subject is moving, you are likely to have only 1 or 2 photos in focus, whereas the rest of them will be out of focus because it doesn't refocus between each shot. I'm a fan of autofocus automatic on the rare occasions that I use autofocus. The K-S1 has 5 autofocus modes available when you are in autofocus mode. The first one is all 11 autofocus points, and the camera will choose what is in focus based on those 11 points. The next one is for the central 5 autofocus points. SEL allows you to choose a single autofocus point to have the camera use as what it will put in focus. SELX, which is selected extended, I believe. You choose a primary autofocus point, and then the surrounding autofocus points provide secondary or refining information. And then center point only. So let's take a look at SEL. Hit OK, hit menu and menu to get out of that. Now, as you can see, you have an autofocus menu item that has popped up on the back of the screen. By using the control pad, you can select which of the 11 autofocus points the camera will use as its autofocus point. So if you know, for instance, that you're at a NASCAR race and the cars are going to be coming in from the left, you can select one of these two autofocus points to have the car on the left of the image and be in focus when you take the picture. If we go into autofocus select extended, here you can see a primary autofocus point with secondary ones providing supporting data. And you can move your autofocus point around and the secondary ones follow it. So again, if you have something coming in from the left and you want it to be in focus with the right side of the image open, this is a good selection to use because this will allow the camera to have a more refined autofocus setup and a more refined focus point than the previous mode. I'm going to leave it in 11 point. Autofocus assist light on or off. The autofocus assist light is on the front of the camera right there. And what that does is in poor lighting conditions, it will send out a green light that will allow the autofocus to have enough light to use to find a focal point. Leaving it on is a good option because it does not come on every single time you use autofocus, only in dim light. And the autofocus light turns off before the picture is taken. Auto exposure metering. Here are your metering selections. The green is your 77 segment averaging meter, where this camera will take data from 77 segments scattered around the entire image and use those 77 data points to develop the optimum image setting. This middle one, which is a dot with parentheses around it, is center weighted, meaning that the majority of the metering data will come from the central 60% or 50% of the image. The rest of the image will provide some metering data, but it will be less important. Spot metering means that only about the center 10% of the image, right in the middle, will be used to calculate image exposure data. So let's talk about when these different settings are ideal for use. In general, average is the best. It will work in most settings and provide a fairly competent exposure anytime you're using it. Center weighted is good if you have a subject in the center area of your photo that you want to have be the primary focus. So for instance, if you're taking a portrait and you want the subject's face to provide the most data, face, shoulders, and a little bit of the background, then this would be a good metering selection for that type of photo. It's also very good if, for instance, you're out at a park or you're in a setting where there's patches of light and dark, and you know that your subject's going to be in a darker patch, but behind them is a lot of brightness. The last setting is spot, and this is also very good for extreme contrast settings. This means that only the very center part of the image will provide metering data. This is also a good setting if you know that what you're taking a picture of will be in the center of the image. If you're taking portraits and the person's face is in the center of the image, this mode will make sure that the person's face is the most properly exposed part of the image. Spot metering has some pretty good uses, and it's a difficult setting to master, but once you've mastered it, it's extremely powerful in terms of giving you a lot of creative control over your images. Digital filter. So these are different digital filters that you can use to apply effects to images you've taken or are going to take. Now, if you turn one of these on, it's going to apply the effect to every one of your photos. So it's best to turn them off and apply them later. Extract color removes one or more colors from the image. Replace color you can use to replace everything blue with red. Toy camera makes the images look like they came from a toy camera. Retro fades out the image and makes it look like it's an old-timey retro color photo. High contrast really jacks up the contrast, so the darks are dark and the whites are white, and there's not a whole lot of tonality in between. Shading will, I believe, provide a vignette around the image. Invert color makes something a negative. So let's say that you have some old film negatives that you or a family member took, and you want to see what they would look like as positives, but you don't want to develop them. You can take a picture of them with invert color, and you'll see what those negatives look like as positives. Unicolor bold boldens the primary color, and bold monochrome converts it to black and white with high contrast. Now, as you'll notice, in each of these modes, there is, except off, you can hit info to go into parameter adjustment. This allows you to fine-tune the different parameters that each of these settings control. So these are fun ways to add character to your images, and you can refine them as well. The last mode is HDR capture, and I've never actually gotten it to turn on in this camera. So HDR capture in most Pentax bodies will let you turn on the HDR mode, and also will let you determine how much of an HDR effect you would like to have. This is record menu number 2. This menu begins with lens correction, and you can turn lens correction on or off. And you can turn on each individual parameter from the lens correction. For instance, you can turn on distortion correction or turn it off. Distortion correction corrects for the amount of distortion that lenses have based on the type of lens. So with the kit lens, if you turn on distortion correction, it will compensate for the distortion that occurs on the wide angle portion, the 18 to 24 millimeter range of the kit lens. This will make your images softer, especially around the borders. So ideally this would be turned off unless you really want to have the images free of distortion because you're taking pictures of brick walls or something. Lateral chromatic aberration adjustment. What this does is if you take a picture of a high contrast setting, say a dark image in front of a white background or vice versa, you will get what's called purple fringing, where there's a magenta glow around the boundary between the light and dark. And that's a function of the way that light hits digital sensors and the way digital sensors see light coming through lenses and how lenses focus light. And it's a matter of physics. There's no way to correct it except through software with this lateral chromatic aberration adjustment. And if you turn it on, it will remove those chromatic aberrations to the best of its ability in the camera. And those are difficult to remove even in Photoshop sometimes. So I tend to leave that on. Peripheral illumination correction. And what this does is for wide angle lenses like an 18 millimeter or similar lenses, or even normal lenses and telephotos at certain apertures, the periphery of the image is darker than the center of the image. And so by turning this on, this compensates for that and lightens the perimeter of the image when it's required. I happen to like a little bit of darkening of the image in the wide angle and telephoto range. It makes what's in the center of the image more pronounced. So I tend to leave that off, but that's a matter of personal preference. And having it on is a very good way to compensate for some vignetting that some lenses do. Diffraction correction, on and off. So diffraction correction on will soften the image a little bit. Under certain cases it actually was supposed to be off, and off it won't. Diffraction occurs when light passes through a small opening. So for instance, your lens aperture, when it shuts down to a certain point beyond about f8 or f11, it's possible to start seeing images becoming softer from the closest object to the furthest in them, because the light coming through that opening is being scattered as it hits the edges of the opening. This is really noticeable at f22, 32, and things like that on a normal lens. Diffraction correction works to remove that softening at small apertures. But like I said, sometimes it can cause the image to be soft. Sometimes it can make this image look over sharp. It's a matter of personal preference, but because I don't tend to shoot much beyond f16, I try to leave this off because I don't think it does too much good for an image. D-range, which is dynamic range settings. Highlight correction and shadow correction. These do the same thing, only opposite. Highlight correction finds areas of the image that are very bright, and then it underexposes them a little bit to remove the highlights. Shadow correction, and you can scale this, auto or low, medium, high, looks for parts of the image that are very dark and overexposes them. Actually, it's improper to say that it under or overexposes them. What it does is, after the image has been taken, it uses algorithms to process them to make them lighter. Now, the problem with both highlight and shadow correction is that it introduces noise and reduces image quality in the areas of highlights and shadows. So it's better to take multiple pictures through bracketing and choose the best one than have the camera automatically correcting the highlights and shadows for you. High ISO noise reduction, custom or setting. Under setting, this is the easier one. You just choose the ISO to have noise reduction begin at and the amount. For custom, you can choose here auto noise reduction. The camera decides whether or not an image requires noise at any level. Low noise reduction, medium or high noise reduction, and off. And custom. For custom, you go into the setting now and choose which setting you would like. And so what I have done is, for these three ISOs, 100 to 160, noise reduction is off. The same thing for up to ISO 320. For 400 to 640, it's at low, and the same thing up to 1250. For 1600 to 5000, it's medium, and for everything above that, it's at high. So this allows me to control how much noise reduction is going to occur in my images, and this is a setting these are settings I set myself, and I find them to be very conducive to having lower noise images. I find that cameras overcorrect for noise, and that leads to a softening of the image and a reduced image quality. Slow shutter noise reduction. This has on and auto. Now what this means is that, let's say you take a slow shutter image. What this will do is, if you press the button once, it will take the photo, and then it will take it again, and it will compare those two images and use those two images to eliminate noise from the one that it's going to actually keep. Both of the images will be the exact same length. So if you're taking a 30-second image, it actually takes a 1-minute image. I like to turn this off because it's basically like taking two images. And if you just want to take one longer image, then you have to take a second one. If you're taking a photo of somebody in that long image, they have to continue sitting still through that second image. Slow shutter speed noise reduction does have a benefit if you're taking pictures of mountains at night, for instance, because they aren't going to move anywhere, and the noise reduction will take out digital noise when it takes the second image. And that can improve image quality. The GPS works with the auto tracer, and you can calibrate it if you have the auto tracer and time sync the camera's clock with the GPS. Since I don't have the auto tracer, it's off. Record menu 3. The first item is live view, and this allows you to make some changes in live view. For instance, your autofocus. Now, these autofocus settings will somewhat work even when you're not in live view. We have our face detect and face detect with contrast correction, catch in focus, which is where it will catch something as it's moving in. This is automatic autofocus mode, which will pick any one of these. This is AF point select, and this is single central AF point. Now you'll notice that compared to the AF menu, these icons are different, which is a little bit of an oversight on Pentax's part. And there's also a duplication of menu functions in this, which is what it is. I like to leave it on face detecting with contrast balance. Focus peaking you can turn on or off. When it's on, images in the live view, only in the live view, not in the viewfinder, will have white boundaries around what is in focus, and it can make it a lot easier to focus if you're doing a movie or if you're using live view to compose your images, because there's a bright boundary around what's in focus. I actually like to leave it off because I like to magnify in live view to zoom in to get fine focus on a point, and I find the focus peaking distracts me from that. Grid display gives you 4 options for your live view grid. A grid, a TV type grid, a crosshairs grid, and off. So what that looks like in live view is here is the grid display. Here is the grid with the X in the middle. Here is the crosshairs. And that's blank. I prefer the grid display for live view because it makes it easiest to compose and make sure that something is horizontal. It's very helpful to have the grid display on for video mode because it gives you a 16 block grid that you can use to compose your images very well. Make sure that your video images are lined up, such as right now. I'm using the grid on my K3 to know that that's flat. Otherwise, this video would probably look something like this. Anyway. It allows you to make sure things are square and pleasing. The histogram display on or off, and what that does is in live view, it turns on a histogram. Right down there in the lower left corner, you can see it, and the histogram lets you know what color channels. Right now, there's a ton of red in the histogram, a lot. If I rotate it up a little bit to try and get it, there we go. Now it's changing a little bit, and you can see that that changes as the image composition changes to let you know what you're seeing. In my mind, that's pretty redundant because I can tell by looking at the image what I'm seeing. Highlight alert alerts you of highlights in the image. So let's see if I can get one of these to show up. See how that's flashing red? That red is a big bright highlight that's going to be super blown out on the final image. And what that's telling me is that that's way too bright right there. The highlight alert can be helpful if you're in full manual mode and are still learning a little bit about how to do settings to make sure that you don't overexpose and underexpose your images. It can also be a bit of a distraction, however, to have something flashing bright red in your live view. Anti-aliasing filter simulator. Now this is something that currently, as of this video's recording, only 3 cameras in the world have. The K-S1, the K3, which is recording this, and the 645Z, which I would love to have one of. The anti-aliasing filter is typically a piece of glass that goes over the sensor, and it reduces or eliminates moire. Moire occurs when you have fabric or other repetitive patterns like buildings or walls, and it creates, instead of the pattern, wavy lines. And you've probably seen these before in some photos. Well, what Ricoh did was they took out the glass anti-aliasing filter because that filter reduces image quality, and cameras without that filter have a sharper image quality. The K5 2S is a great example of a camera without an anti-aliasing filter that has amazing image quality. And on their next generation of cameras, starting with the K3, they released the AA filter simulator. And what that does is, instead of having a piece of glass over the sensor, let's say my hand is a sensor and you take a picture. It moves around a little bit. And then the camera uses that movement to read the image multiple times and ascertain what the actual pattern is. So you get anti-aliasing without the image quality loss of the glass anti-aliasing filter. And the anti-aliased images from these newest Pentax cameras are just as sharp as cameras without the anti-aliasing filter. That said, I like to leave mine off because it does physically move the sensor around, which can introduce a little bit of camera shake, and I do a lot of tripod photography, and I don't want the sensor moving when it's on a tripod because it's going to cause a little bit of image sharpness loss due to sensor movement and the resulting camera shake. Handheld, it doesn't make a difference. And a lot of the times, if I'm going to take pictures of people especially, I will turn that on so that I don't get moire in their clothes. Shake reduction is on right now because I was hand holding this the other day, but I typically leave it off if I'm using a tripod. If I'm not using a tripod, it stays on. Now, many camera makes have shake reduction built into the lens. And what that means is that the lens physically moves glass elements within it to correct for movement of the camera. Well, that's wonderful and all, except that because the movement is occurring on a different plane than the lens elements, let's say you're holding your camera and you move it, the sensor is right here where the movement's occurring, okay? If these are moving, to compensate, they have to move significantly more because the radius of the movement is greater than it is at the sensor. So what Pentax does is, as this moves, the sensor moves counter to it to make sure that the image stays in focus. Now this is all, of course, very exaggerated. If you move your camera this much, no camera is going to keep the image in focus. But if you're holding it and just twitching it very, very slightly with just hand movement, like right now, the Pentax can do a very good job of keeping the image in focus because the sensor moves and does not have to move very much. This camera actually gives 4 stops of image shake reduction. So what does 4 stops of shake reduction actually mean? And to put that in perspective, there's a rule of thumb that says you should not handhold a camera at a shutter speed which is slower than the reciprocal of the focal length. And this is true down to 50 millimeters, and shorter than that, it's a good idea never to handhold a camera slower than 1/50th of a second. But case in point, 4 stops of shake reduction could mean 1/50th of a second here, 1/25th is 1 stop, 1/12th is 2, 1/6th is 3, 1/3 is 4. Now I will tell you this camera actually is not going to have shake reduction down to 1/3 of a second. But where this really plays in is with telephotos. If you've got a 200 to 400 millimeter lens, typically, let's take a 400 millimeter lens, you could not handhold it slower than about 1/500th of a second. 1 stop of shake reduction is 1/250th, 2 stops is 1/125th, 3 stops is 1/60th, and 4 stops is 1/30th. That means theoretically, if you're very stable and have a monopod or something to brace your arms with, you can handhold telephoto lenses to a very long shutter speed relative to other cameras that have 1 or 2 stops of shake reduction built into their lenses. Now it should be said that all of that is tested with laboratory tests, and real-world performance is different based on how shaky people are and subjects, wind, footing, things like that. But suffice to say that the shake reduction on this camera is very impressive and very effective. The last item here, which is grayed out, is input focal length. And if you're using a lens that does not communicate with the camera, or that is not a Pentax lens, then you are able at this point to input the focal length. I'll show you how that works. This is the lens that I use, fun fact, in each of my videos to focus on the viewfinders. Input focal length. Well, it's not 18 millimeters, it's actually 50. So you can change the focal length. If you have a zoom, you don't need to change the focal length every time you zoom in and out. I usually just set it to the minimum zoom. And here we go, 50. Another thing, if you have a non-Pentax lens, whenever you turn it on, that menu will automatically pop up and you can select the lens's focal length. Record menu 4. Instant review. Instant review means that if it is on to any amount of time after you take a picture, that picture will pop up on the screen for you to review for 1, 3, or 5 seconds, or until you turn it off. I leave that set to off because instant review drains batteries like nobody's business. It leaves the screen on all the time, which is the biggest battery drain in a camera. And frankly, this camera drains batteries surprisingly quickly as it is, and turning off instant review is a good way to preserve battery life. Also, having instant review on makes it very tempting to always look at your photo right after you've taken them, and you might end up missing more shots than you could have if you weren't looking at them every time. Alright, zoom instant review. What this does is after you take a picture, if the instant review is on, when you use the command dial, you can zoom in and out to review it automatically. I prefer to leave that off because if you have a function associated with the command dial, such as aperture value or shutter or aperture value, depending on what you have set to this dial, if you want to take another photo quickly and change those settings, you're not changing those settings, you're just zooming in on the image. So turning off zoom instant review is a really good idea because zoom instant review actually just interferes with the next photo that you want to take. Save raw data saves the image's raw data from the most recent photo that you've just taken. So if you take a photo and you're set only to JPEG mode, you can go into your play menu or your instant review, and for your last photo you can salvage a raw copy of it before you take your next photo. Delete gives you the ability to delete a photo if you push the delete button during instant review. Histogram display displays the histogram during instant review. It makes the image a little bit smaller or overlays the histogram on the bottom of it. I'm not a huge fan of this because it detracts from the looking at the image if you do have instant review on, and it gets in the way with seeing if the image turned out well. highlight alert, similar to what we saw with live view where it was flashing red, where there was a highlight, will indicate if there are any highlights in the image during instant review. That's another thing that I like to turn off because I find it distracting, but that said, I don't really use instant review very often. Button customization. There are 4 buttons which you're able to customize when you are using this camera. The first button is the AFL AEL button, which is this one right here, and it allows you to switch, and it has 4 options you can use. You can enable autofocus, which is autofocus 1, which is autofocus is performed when this button is pressed. So with this setting, enable autofocus 1, you can autofocus by half depressing the shutter or pressing the AF AEL button. AF2 is with the shutter release button. When this disables the half depress on the shutter release button for autofocus, so autofocus only works with this button. This mode, if you hold this button down, then autofocus is turned off with the shutter release button, but only when you hold this down. And AEL and AEL lock locks the exposure value when the autofocus and AEL button is pressed. So what this means, and this is actually the best use for this button in 99% of situations, is that if you take a meter reading and it says 1/125th at f5.6, and now you go and point the camera into darkness, it's going to change unless you hold this button down. So when's this useful? Let's say you're sitting at a cafe in Vienna and there's a cool building behind you and your fiance or girlfriend or significant other, whatever it is, or boyfriend sitting under a canopy with you. So you're both in the shade and there's this brightly lit scene that's really neat behind you. And so what you do is you take a meter reading in the shade and then you compose your image holding this button down and take it, and it will keep the meter reading from the shade, which will allow whomever you're taking the photo of to be exposed well, with the subject in the back being a little bit bright. Now, if you didn't do that, what would happen is the subject in the back would be exposed perfectly, but the person you're actually taking the picture of would be very dark. So this is actually the best and most useful use for this button. The next one is AF AEL button in movie mode, and it has the exact same options, and again, that's the best use for the button in most photographic situations. This is the green button, which is on top right here behind the shutter release. And the options for the green button, include optical preview, well, green button, which means just it functions like the green button, puts you into green mode temporarily. RAW means you can push this button. If you're in JPEG format by default and you push the button, it will take the next image as a RAW image as well as a JPEG. Optical preview means that it stops the lens down so that you can see your approximate depth of field. I'll show you what that means in just a moment. Digital preview means that on the screen it will show you your depth of field by taking a dummy picture that it's not actually going to save. And it's good for seeing a test shot on your screen. So if you do most of your photography with live view, this is the best use of this button. If you do most of your photography through the viewfinder, this is the best use. And AF active area, and if you push it with this mode, it should tell you what autofocus points are being used to take an image, either the ones that are currently in focus or the ones in general that are being used. I'm not sure which. Here is the optical preview. So I'm going to switch to F11 so you can see what this does. And if you're looking through your viewfinder and you push this green button, you can see that it stops the aperture down, so you can see the depth of field. Now let's go into this again and go to digital preview. So I'm going to line up my photo here. And now I'm going, instead of taking the picture, I'm going to use the green button to get a digital preview of the photo. I can either hit the AV button now to save it to the memory card, or I can just go on and it won't have taken the photo. That's a really good option if you use a lot of live view, or if you have a small memory card or are running out of memory card space. That can save you from taking photos that take up memory card space with photos that you're later going to delete. E-dial programming allows you to determine which way you're going to rotate this button, left or right, to change exposure value settings, and to change shutter speed and aperture value settings. So this is just whether rotating it left decreases aperture or time, or increases aperture or time. And you can do it one or the other. The memory function allows the user to determine what aspects of the image will be saved in the JPEG's EXIF data. The items you can save in the JPEG's EXIF data include the flash mode, specifically the items we looked at in video 2 under this left control panel button. Drive mode, specifically continuous or single frame, which we saw in video 2 in this right control panel button. The type of white balance, which would be what we accessed under the white balance button here in the second video. Custom image settings, which we saw in the first record item tab earlier in this video. The sensitivity, which is the ISO setting. Exposure value compensation, which would be used to record if you're over or underexposing intentionally or using bracketing. This is very useful if you're going to do HDR images in post, such as in Photoshop. The next is the flash exposure compensation, which records whether or not you used a more or less powerful flash setting. The second one has digital filter, if you did or did not use a digital filter, such as the cross-processing or the cool fade retro looks. Whether or not you had HDR capture on. The last two items, shooting info display and playback info display, will allow the EXIF data that we've just checked to be displayed in either the instant review or playback menus in different instant review and playback menu views. Video menu, there's only one tab here, so this is the only video menu. This allows you to choose some characteristics that will control how your videos are recorded. Movie capture settings. Recorded pixels are full HD versus HD, and this is the video size in terms of pixels high and pixels wide. I don't remember what the different settings are. I think they're 1080 and 720, and I don't know if it's P or I, but typically full HD is better because you can always downsample it in free software on Windows computers if you have a Windows computer. You cannot upgrade image quality. In your frame rate, you can choose between 30, 25, and 24, and this is good for reducing flicker if there are flickering objects like light bulbs, for instance. I tend to shoot at 30p because it provides a very nice, smooth video. Recording sound level has a few different options: auto, manual, and mute. In manual, you can control how loud you have to speak in order for the microphone to pick it up. In mute, the microphone doesn't pick up anything, and in auto, the microphone will record at a volume that keeps sound consistent. With manual, if you set it to the wrong setting, you might sound like you're shouting all the time, even if you're not. So for this, I tend to leave it in auto, even though, honestly, the microphones on these don't record more than about 3 to 4 feet away from the camera. And the problem with that, of course, is that if you're using this in most any setting, it's not going to record what you want it to record. More on that in video 4, where we talk about video functions. The next is a digital filter, which you can turn on or off under different settings. This is another one. I've never figured out how to get the digital filter to turn on, but bear in mind that if you turn it on, your video will be recorded with that digital filter and you cannot remove it. Video shake reduction is on or off. If you are shooting on a tripod, it is very important to turn video shake reduction off. If you don't, then what will happen is you'll have a very shaky image that will look like it's what's called jello effect, and things will stretch and move and seem very unnatural and disturbing. And if you're hand holding it, shake reduction works very well, but trust me, not with a tripod. Playback menu, and there is only one playback menu. So the first item here is slideshow. The playback menu alert informs everything that happens when you hit this play button. So under slideshow, you can start a slideshow to see everything that is saved on your memory card. You can display the slides, the different photos, for a set number of seconds. You can have transitions during your slideshow as it plays back on your camera. You can loop or not. And you can automatically start movies, or you can manually start movies. And then start starts the slideshow. Quick zoom off or on. What this means is that when you're in playback mode, you can zoom automatically one of these set amounts into the image. My preference is to leave it off because it allows you to zoom a little bit, adjust where you're zooming to, zoom a little bit more, and it's actually quicker to get to the part of the image that you want to zoom into. Highlight alert in playback mode will flash red where there are highlights, just like we saw earlier, and will not flash red where there aren't highlights. That's something I prefer to leave off because when I look at something in playback, I want to know how the image looks, not what the camera thinks it looks like. Auto image rotation, if you take a photo in portrait, which is more shaped like this, instead of landscape, which is the shape you're looking at right now, then this will automatically rotate the image in playback mode. This is a good thing to have if you don't want to have to rotate your camera during playback mode when you're sharing images. Protect all images will automatically make it so that nothing on the camera can be deleted. Delete all images deletes everything on the camera. That's the playback menu. This is the first of the 4 setup menus. Language adjustment allows you to select what language the display will be in. I'm not going to change it because I have a very real fear that I won't be able to change it back. Date adjustment allows you to change the format of day, month, day, year, and so on, 24-hour and 12-hour. Date allows you to manually enter the date, item at a time. The time allows you to manually enter the time. Settings complete saves the settings. If you back out of that menu without hitting settings complete, it will not save the settings. World time, so time setting for home. My hometown is San Francisco. My destination is, well, where do I actually want to go to? Let's say I wanted to go to Chicago. It's 2 hours ahead of San Francisco. It is not daylight savings time right now. So there we go. Destination time is 12:07 a.m. Here it is only 10:07 p.m. Text size is standard versus large. Large is, what that does is that makes the highlighted item larger, which just looks very strange to me. But it does make it easier to read the menu item that's highlighted that you're looking at right then. So the sound effect is your beep. And you can control the volume or mute it. And you can turn the beep on for when your camera's in focus, and this is on or off. When you have automatic exposure lock, when you have the self timer counting down, when the remote control is being used, when the autofocus point changes, or when you've pushed the button to change your file format for one image. I will say that if you're going to, my preference is to have it muted all the time, because I don't like to disturb other people around me and other photographers, and I also personally find the beeping extremely annoying. Whenever I push a button, it makes a noise. Self-timer really is the most useful beep, because it gives you an audible cue if it's too bright out, to see the lights that are counting down on the grip. The next menu item is the LCD display, and I'll tell you, I could not find out what the guide display function does. I couldn't find any reference to it online. Nothing that I searched for told me what this option does. I've turned it on and off, I've checked different menus, the LCD, the viewfinder LCD, nothing that I can figure out changes. So I really have no idea what guide display does. Display color I can help you with though. There are a number of colors in here, 12 in fact, and it changes the color scheme of the menu. So you can change it to whatever makes it easiest for you to see, or what you just happen to like the best. I happen to like number 11 the best, but there are lots of good options in here. They're all actually really well designed and fairly complementary. LCD display settings allow you to adjust and fine-tune how the LCD display shows images in movies. For instance, brightness. If you want to conserve your battery, you can turn the brightness all the way down, and unless you're shooting during bright daylight, it'll be fine. Or if you're out in the daylight, you can turn it all the way up. In most settings, you can have your brightness down a notch or two, and you'll be just fine. The color saturation levels increases how much saturation there is in the images. I like to keep that in the middle because I want to know how the image actually looks and how it will look on the screen when I get it back to my computer, instead of having it be falsely saturated on my camera's screen. This is your blue-amber adjustment, which changes your color balance between blue and amber. Again, this is one I like to keep neutral because I don't want to have a false color on my camera screen, because that will influence the settings that I use, and my images will not look as good on my computer screen. These modes, these three right here, the saturation, the blue amber, and then the green magenta, which is the same as blue amber but for different colors, will allow you to fine-tune your LCD screen here to match the appearance of your computer screen. But if you don't or can't do that, leaving them in the middle is a great option. And at any time, if you put one of these too far off and you want to reset it, just hit the green button and it resets it. You can also hit the command dial to go from the standard gradient screen that will let you know how things look to an image. And you can select a specific image, and you can alter the color balance to see how it does or doesn't look with different colors. Almost black and white, very saturated. And that is setup menu number 1. Setup menu number 2 has the USB connection, how it's going to communicate to the computer if you use the USB cord. That's peer-to-peer, or I believe it's master-slave is the other one. I just leave this as the default setting because I never hook my cameras up to the computer. If I want to transfer files, which I do frequently, I simply pull the SD card out of the camera and put it in the computer because it's a faster file transfer than using a USB cable. So to me, that's not an incredibly useful option. HDMI out allows you to change the HDMI out 1080i, 720, 576, or 480, or automatically select based on what is receiving the HDMI signal. Auto is probably the best unless you have a specific reason to have a different setting. Folder name, you can change the folder name that it creates on your memory card. So let's say, for instance, that you're going to a birthday party. You could put the kid's initial, AB, BD for AB birthday, 1 for the first folder, and then it will automatically number them differently. Or if you're a wedding photographer, you could have the initials of the first initial of the last names of the two people being married, and WD for wedding. And that way, if you have 2 shoots in one day, you can change the folder names and find easily where one shoot ends and the next one begins without having to sort through hundreds of photos to find it. You can create a new folder at any time by telling it to create a new folder, and then it will start putting new images into a new folder. That's actually easier than changing the name of your folder. File name. You can customize what you want your names to start with. So all of mine start with Pentax K-S1 and then started 0001 and went up. And since I don't use Adobe color spaces, that's kind of useless to me. But I have the same for videos so that they will be in sequence, because I take videos sometimes that support my still images. You could also just change this to be VIDO or something like that. You have 4 characters to play with. If you want to have your videos sorted by file name on your computer differently from your images, it's a good idea to have this have a different prefix. To change the file name in both settings, you would click from this highlight, you would click the right button on the control pad, and now you can scroll through and select what you want your file name to be. OK, we'll keep the file name. Menu will back out. Oops. OK, rather, we'll select the letter you were on. I'm going to hit menu because I don't actually want to change that. File number, sequential numbering, day after day after day after day, which I happen to like because it lets me know how many photos I'm taking. Or reset the file number, 0001, next time you go out on a shoot. And this is a manual reset right here. So all you have to do is reset the file number and it will go back to 0001. Copyright information allows you to embed copyright information into your photo's EXIF data. So this is on or off. And you can have your name as the photographer. If you are photographing this for a magazine or as an assignment, you can have the copyright holder be a different person. I tend to leave that blank because I'm doing all of this just for myself, for fun. And that's the end of the second setup menu. Setup menu number 3. The first menu item here is flicker reduction, and I believe that is the flickering of this LCD screen, though I could be wrong on that. This was something I could not find a lot out about. Actually, I couldn't find anything out about what this option does. One of the problems with new cameras is there's not a whole lot of information about them on the internet just yet. Auto power off will automatically turn off the camera after however long you want it to be, from 1 minute to half an hour or never. I happen to like 5 minutes, and on this camera, which chews through batteries like a pit bull through a stuffed toy, it's a good idea to have that be a slightly shorter time, although 1 minute, frankly, is too short. Indicator lamps, you can adjust the brightness of the indicator lamps, which are on the back here, as well as the indicator lamp, which is on the grip around the shutter button and on the front. And that can help if you're going to be in a light area and you're going to be using the self-timer quite a bit, or you just like to have them be brighter. You can also turn them completely off. Self-timer, this says the lights will or will not light up for the self-timer, and the lights will or will not light up when the remote control is used. Wireless memory card. This has functions with the Wi-Fi flu card that Pentax makes, which I don't have one of, so I can't really show you what it does, for which I apologize. And reset returns the camera to factory default settings. I'm going to back out of that now. Setup menu number 4. This first item is pixel mapping. And what pixel mapping does is it tells the camera to check the sensor for bad pixels. Now there are 20 million pixels on this, so if there are a couple of hundred that are bad, the camera just says, well, I won't record data from those and I'll use the data from the surrounding pixels to interpolate what's supposed to be there. And it takes a lot of dead pixels before the image quality is affected. Pixel mapping is a good way to make sure that you don't have what are called hot pixels, which is where you take a picture of, say, the night sky, and there's a whole bunch of bright red stars in there because the pixels have died. So pixel mapping is a good thing to do every 3 to 6 months, or if you've been using your camera quite a bit. I try to do it about every 3 to 6 months myself, and it does help a lot with shortening the amount of time you have to spend in Photoshop or other programs taking hot pixels out of images. And for pixel mapping, you do need to have a full battery, which I don't have, which is strange because it actually only takes about 10 seconds for pixel mapping to occur. Dust removal. Dust removal gives you a few options. So right now, if you hit OK, it will perform dust removal by shaking the sensor to knock dust off of it. You can also have it be a startup action and a shutdown action, and what this means is that anytime you start up or shut down the camera, or both, it will perform dust removal. I think it's a good idea to have it do it at both startup and shutdown because a dust on a sensor results in a dark colored spot somewhere, and you have to take those out in Photoshop one by one, and it's kind of a pain to do. So I'm going to leave those on and I'll show you what happens when you turn the camera off. Dust removal. Dust removal when it turns back on. Sensor cleaning. Again, you need to have a full battery for this, and I have an entire video on how to clean a DSLR sensor, and if I don't put that in the description, a link to that, remind me and I'll add a link to it in the description when you point it out. But the mirror up raises the mirror so you can put a brush on the sensor to clean it off. And it's a good idea if you have dust that just is persistent and the dust removal startup action and shutdown action won't remove it. You have to manually clean it, and this is how you get to that function to do it. This is safer than going into bulb mode and just holding the shutter down. That's a really good way to accidentally release the shutter and have it close, have the shutter and the mirror close on a cleaning brush, which will absolutely ruin your camera. I'm going to back out because I don't have enough battery power. Format. All data is going to be deleted. Don't want to do that. So we can cancel out of that. Firmware info and options. This tells you what version of the firmware you have. Unfortunately, by the time I have to return this camera, there will be no firmware updates. Otherwise, I would show you now how to do a firmware update. The directions on Ricoh's website are typically very good. In general, what you have to do is have a blank memory card, no folders on it. You have to put the unzipped firmware software onto the memory card, put it into the camera when it's off, and then turn the camera on holding a button, and I forget which button it is, and then it will boot up and install the firmware. And this also requires, when you install firmware, a full battery. And it's a good idea to have the latest firmware because even though Pentax releases their cameras, well, even though Ricoh typically releases their cameras pretty complete, bugs do turn up and the firmware fixes those bugs. Fortunately, most of the bugs that would be in this camera, because it has the same processor as the K3 that's recording this, were worked out in the K3 already. So the firmware in this is built upon the previous year of K3 users' experiences and improvements, and it's pretty solid because of that. So here we are into the last 4 menus. These are the custom settings menus. And these allow you to fine-tune some of the camera's performance. So EV steps, that stands for exposure value steps. And in the previous video I said I would show you how to change it so that the sensitivity can go from 100 to 200 to 400, or 100 to 150 to 200 to 300 to 400, or to 100 to 125, 160, and so on. Those are called exposure value steps, 1/3 or 1/2. So actually you cannot set it to full stops in this camera. It is only 1/2 or 1/3. 1/3 allows more fine-tuned control than 1/2 exposure value stops. And so I like to have that because I can set the aperture, the shutter speed, and the sensitivity in third stop increments. Sensitivity steps is either, here's where you can set it to 100, 200, 400 for sensitivity, or in the same way that exposure value is set as either thirds or halves. I like to keep this the same because it makes it easier to fine-tune my settings. Meter operating time. This is how long the light meter will be on when you have to press the shutter button. 10 seconds, 3 seconds, or 30 seconds. I like 10 seconds. 3 seconds might not be enough for me to get all the data I need, and 30 seconds is pretty excessive and wastes a lot of battery power. AEL, which is auto exposure lock, with AF locked, with autofocus locked. And what this means is that if your autofocus is locked on a subject, if your autofocus is locked on my hand, and the exposure will then be based off of what the focus is locked on. With this turned off, the exposure will be based on perhaps the entire scene, even if what is in focus is in a lighter or darker part of the scene. So this is a good idea if you want what is in focus to be properly exposed. AEL with AF locked. What this does, on or off, is that auto exposure is locked when the focus is locked, meaning that if your focus is locked on something, the exposure settings will not change. Your aperture and shutter speed will remain consistent, or your sensitivity will also remain consistent if you have that on auto. This is a good idea to have on because it allows you to make sure that your settings don't shift as something moves in and out of focus, or something that is in focus moves into different lighting. Link exposure and focus point. What this does is your exposure will be based on the focus point. So whatever is in focus here in the image is how the meter will expose the image. And so that allows the camera to change its exposure settings based on the meter data. Now, interestingly, it's actually better with that option to turn this off, because this way your exposure value can change if your subject that you're in focus, that you're focusing on, moves in and out of different lighting areas with different lighting. This combination of AEL with AF as 1 and linking AE to AF as 2 is very good if you use AF continuous or AF auto modes. Auto exposure value compensation. Does not use automatic exposure value compensation when the exposure is not obtained. So what this does is on or off. If it is off, the camera will take the picture as you tell it to. If it is on, then the camera will have the ability, if it so chooses, to automatically override your image settings if you under or overexpose an image. That's a big problem if you are intentionally under or overexposing an image to obtain a certain effect. I like to keep this off because, frankly, I don't really trust a camera to know what I have in my mind when I'm taking a picture, and I don't want to cede the control over exposure to the camera. It's one of the reasons I like auto aperture priority and full manual mode for most of my shooting. Bulb mode options. Now, if you'll remember from the last video, I said I'd show you how to make bulb mode work by either holding the button down to keep the shutter open, or by pressing it once to open it and pressing it once to close it. This is that menu. Type 1, press and hold the shutter button to keep it open. Type 2, press once, press a second time. And since this camera has built-in shutter speeds of up to 30 seconds, type 1 means you're really only going to be using bulb mode for exposures longer than 30 seconds. So it makes no sense to do it that way. You should, I think you would benefit most if you're going to use the bulb mode from having it be type 2, which is time mode, press to open, press to close. The exception to that is if you're going to do darkroom flash photography, but that's a rare exception for most people. Custom settings menu number 2. So in the previous video I talked about bracketing, and I said I would show you in the third video how to set your bracketing order. This is that function. So bracketing was one underexposed, one properly exposed, and one overexposed image in sequence. So first option is proper exposure, under, then over. Second is under, proper, over. Third is over, proper, under. And fourth is proper, over, under. I think logically this one makes the best sense for me because you're going least to most in sequence over and over, and it's easier to differentiate where one sequence of bracketing ends and the other one begins. Two is the easiest setting to use. 3 is the second easiest setting to use. The other two are confusing unless you want to have the properly exposed image first and then judge based on that whether or not you are going to keep or use for anything the over and underexposed images. But I'm going to leave this at 2. One push bracketing. Now in the second video I also said I would tell you how to set this so that you could push the shutter button once to take 3 images or 3 times to take 3 images. This is that setting. Setting it to on means push the shutter button once and boom, 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 it takes 3 images in a bracketed order. Off means image 1, image 2, image 3 to bracket your photos when you use the bracketing image mode. I'm going to leave this as on. White balance adjustment range. So this is fixed or auto adjustment. So what this means is that if you say fixed, you control the camera's white balance. If you specify shade, the camera will white balance according to the shade setting. If you say fluorescent or tungsten, it will white balance according to the settings that it has in its processor for those white balance settings. Auto adjustment effectively makes it constantly auto white balance. This means that if you set it to tungsten outside, it's going to say, you numpty nuts, you're outside, I'm going to use the outside white balance anyway. So if you want to use white balance for creative effects, this is going to undermine that. I tend to leave this on fixed because I don't want to give control of this over to the camera, because I'd like to use white balance to achieve a certain effect, and setting it to auto adjustment will not allow me to do that. White balance when using flash. This has 4 options. Auto white balance all the time, period, end of story when you use flash. Multi-auto white balance when you're using flash, period, end of story all the time. Flash white balance when you use the flash, period, end of story all the time. Or unchanged from whatever your white balance setting is. I actually like to use the multi-auto white balance on this because often I'm using a flash in a setting where there's other types of light as well, tungsten or fluorescent or daylight, and using the flash to fill. This allows the light from the flash, which is a different type and temperature from other types of lighting, to not clash with the other surrounding lighting, and this tends to yield a higher quality image in terms of proper coloration than any of the other settings. Auto white balance under tungsten lighting. This is strong or subtle correction, and this is basically how much blue the camera injects into the image when it's processing for tungsten white balance. I prefer subtle correction because when I have tungsten lighting, I like to keep some of that redness and that warmth. Tungsten lighting is very good for illuminating people for that reason, because you can give people's skin a little bit of a healthier glow by keeping subtle correction. If you use strong correction and you use tungsten lighting, it's going to make an image very blue and very cool and make it feel a lot colder, for lack of a better word, than with subtle correction. Color temperature steps. In Kelvin or mirrored. I don't actually know anything about either of these. I tend to keep it in Kelvin because that's the default, but mirrored's another scale, and I don't know, whatever you know, go with it. Superimpose the AF, the autofocus area, on or off. What this does is with on, when you look through the viewfinder, a little red window or red box will appear that lets you know what is in focus. With manual focus lenses, a single red box in the center will appear to let you know that something somewhere in the image is in focus, but with autofocus Pentax lenses, red boxes will illuminate wherever something is in focus. Some Pentax lenses, those red boxes will appear with manual focus as well, but not every Pentax lens I tried worked with my FA Limited that I'm using to record this, that worked. With the kit 18 to 55 millimeter lens that this came with, that did not work. I'm going to leave that as on because I like to know, just as a backup to what I believe to be the case, that something is in focus or what is in focus actually is. This also allows me to determine if I have a diopter adjustment that I need to make, or if I've bumped the diopter adjustment accidentally. Because if it's over here on one side, and then what appears to be in focus to me is not what's going to be in focus on the film plane. Same thing if it goes to the other side. So this is also a good way to safeguard yourself against accidentally changing your diopter. So I'm going to leave that as on. Custom settings menu number 3, AFS settings. AFS is focus or release priority. AFS was the autofocus single shot. So this means that it will focus and then keep that focus through a sequence of shots if you're in continuous mode without refocusing between shots. It also means that in order to focus, you have to press the shutter button or use the autofocus button depending on how your camera is set up. So focus priority means that the camera will not take a picture until something is in focus. So your autofocus might hunt in low light to try to find something, but the camera won't take a picture if it's going to be blurry. Release priority means even if it's blurry, the camera's going to take a picture. I prefer focus priority for this because if I'm using AFS, it's because I want to have a specific thing in focus, such as a softball player coming around the bases or one of my friends at our bowling league. With a similar option is the first frame of action in AF continuous. So what this means is that in AF continuous, where the autofocus will continue to track something as it moves, the first photo that you shoot is either not going to be taken until it's in focus, automatic for the camera to determine what it thinks is best, or the camera will take it even if it's not in focus in AFC. This is really good if you have something that's coming into focus that you want to track and you want to start taking the photos before it gets to the point where you are ready to have the best photo. So for instance, in sporting events and things like that. I happen to like focus priority for this one as well because personal pet peeve is I don't like coming back to my computer and going through 30 out of focus photos before I get to one that is in focus. Action in AFC continuous shooting. Same thing, focus, auto, or frames per second priority. Frames per second maintaining capture frame rate takes priority over focus tracking, meaning that if you're in high speed or low speed shooting mode, this is the same thing as release priority. It will take a picture to maintain your frame rate regardless of whether or not something is in focus. I actually like auto for this one. I don't use AFC all that often, but I tend to leave this in either auto or focus priority. I don't want to have 5.2 frames per second for 3 seconds of out of focus images. That's 15 or 16 photos I've got to go through when I come back because it was in frame rate priority instead of focus priority. So actually, even though I am okay with auto for this, I'm going to leave it in focus priority. Hold AF status. So what this is in your autofocus mode, it places in this setting a very high priority on maintaining the existing subject that is in focus. So it's not going to change subjects. So let's say you've got a picture of your girlfriend up close, and then behind her just happens to be a sports car. If you get the autofocus to lock onto your girlfriend, it's not going to just suddenly switch to the sports car because that takes up more of the frame and get you in trouble later. Not that I've been there. Medium places a slightly lower priority, lowest priority, but still more than off, which means that this is going to have autofocus track what is taking up the most of the largest portion of the image, or that is having the most action. I like high because once I lock onto a subject, I don't want to lose that subject. I know what I want to take a picture of, and I want to keep tracking that subject with autofocus. Autofocus when using the remote control, off or on. I prefer off because if I'm using the remote, I'm also going to be using manual focus. I'm not typically, and I'm sure there are situations where you could use the remote control and need autofocus. I think that seems fairly rare. But what this does is this allows you to use autofocus with the remote control unit or without the remote control unit. I did that in the wrong order, but you know what I mean. Release while charging the flash. So you can say on or off. What this means is that if I pop up the flash right now and take a picture, it's not charged, but it will still take a picture. I personally like to take pictures even when the flash isn't charged. And the reason is because if I need to take a quick picture, I can recover much of what the flash doesn't illuminate in RAW, unless no picture was taken. Then I can't recover anything from the raw data. But this is a matter of personal preference. If you don't want to take pictures without the flash when the flash is on, it's better to set that to off. Color space, sRGB or Adobe RGB. sRGB is universal, can be read by everything. Adobe can only be read by Adobe's programs and maybe a couple of other things. sRGB is the default, and this is one I recommend strongly not changing. The last menu screen, the fourth custom settings menu. Save rotation info. This saves the camera's orientation, horizontal or vertical, landscape or portrait, in the image's EXIF data so that when you open it up in a photo editing program such as Photoshop, Picasa, or if you just upload it straight to Google+, for instance, the image will automatically orient to the right direction if this is on. If it's off, every image will display landscape regardless of how you took them, landscape or portrait. I like to have that on because I don't want to have to manually rotate every portrait photo that I take. Save menu location, reset or save. Reset means that every time you enter into the menu, after exiting it, it goes to the first menu item. Save menu location means that every time you enter the menu after exiting, it goes back to where you were. Probably should have turned that on before this video started, too late now, but typically I like to reset the menu because most of the functions on this camera that are useful are right here. 75 to 85% of the time, these are the functions you will use the most when accessing the menu on this camera. Catch in focus is on or off. Catch in focus right now is disabled. The camera will not auto-fire as subject enters the focus zone. Here, catch in focus is enabled and the camera will automatically fire as the subject enters the focus zone. So what you can do here is set your focus manually. And you know for certain that you've got a train coming, and it's going to be coming from the right or the left. It's going to be crossing this bridge. It's going to be an awesome photo, and you're standing a safe distance away because it's a train and they're dangerous. But you also want to be able to have this automatically fire when the train is in focus. So you can set your camera a little bit closer to the train tracks and then set this to on, And when the train enters the focus zone, if you're focused properly where the train will be, you can be 20 feet away from your camera, and there you go. It will take the picture for you. And that's really good if you don't want to be like that guy who was taking the selfie as the train went by and the conductor's foot hit him in the side of the head. Nobody wants to be that guy. I don't use this very often, so I just leave it to off. Autofocus fine adjustment. And this is off, apply to all, or apply to one lens. And this allows you to fine-tune the autofocus for your lenses. And off means that the lenses will focus according to factory default tolerances specified in the camera's programming. This applies the same autofocus fine-tune adjustments which you can make in the camera to every lens. Or if you only have one lens that you use autofocus on, you can apply it only to one lens. Or if you only have one that seems to function slightly out of tolerance. I leave it off. I've never had an issue where a lens doesn't function properly or requires fine adjustment to focus properly. Using the aperture ring. Enable or disable. What that means is that on cameras that do not have an automatic aperture ring, so for instance you can see here that has an A on the aperture ring. For cameras that do not, the only way to set the aperture is by adjusting the aperture ring. If you set this to enable, the camera will stop down the lens if you have the ring manually set. If you set this to disable, you will not be able to, the shutter will not release the aperture when the aperture ring is not set to the A position. So this is a shutter lock. And what this means is that for lenses that do not have an A on it, if you turn this to disable, you won't be able to use those. If you turn it to enable, you can. Since I have a lot of old lenses, I like to leave that as enable. And reset all custom settings restores everything on these 4 custom settings menus marked by the C to the factory settings. I'm going to hit menu because I don't want to do that. So this has been the 3rd video of 4 about this Pentax K-S1. We've gone through every single menu function this camera has to offer. The 4th video is going to take a look at how to shoot videos with this camera. So if this video was helpful, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know I'm on the right track. If you have any questions, corrections, or if you can fill in some of the details about some of those menu items that I could not find any information about, please do so in the comments. Same thing, if you have ideas for future videos, please let me know. And one last thing, I know this was a long and very detailed video. Thank you guys for watching.